On the 8th of July 1944, the 1st Battalion, Highland Light Infantry of Canada, put in a deliberate attack on elements of the 3rd Battalion of SS Panzergrenadier Regiment 25, occupying the fortified town of Buron, or Buron in English. The battle took place 32 days and 17 kilometers from the landings of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division on Juno Beach on D-Day. On D-Day, the HLI had been the reserve battalion of the division's reserve brigade and avoided major casualties. In fact, not a single HLI man died on June 6th, and even a month later, only 17 soldiers of the regiment had lost their lives. Each loss a tragedy, but only a fraction of the 137 fatalities in the Regina Rifle Regiment, or the 136 in the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada during the same time period. The 12th SS Panzer Division had also been in reserve on D-Day, as the Germans gave the task of beach defense to the poorly equipped coastal defense divisions. Standard German practice was to counterattack landing beaches with the tanks and mechanized infantry of their panzer divisions. Like the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the 12th SS Panzer was an inexperienced formation that had yet to see major action by June 1944. Famously, the division had been raised from Hitler Youth members born in 1926, stiffened by a cadre of Russian front veterans of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the famous Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, which rotated men between the front line and guard duty at Hitler's various headquarters. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had been tasked with fighting ashore and then defeating the armoured counterattacks that Allied planners expect to hit the beachheads. And over the course of the first days of the invasion, they did exactly that, exacting a heavy toll of the SS Panzermen who flung themselves against the beachhead. The inexperienced SS had impatient commanders, overconfident in their abilities, and unable to properly appreciate, plan, and coordinate their attacks. Their inability to break through the Canadians or push them back to the beach led to frustration and a rash of well-documented murders of Canadian prisoners of war. The front line stabilized within the first week of fighting, the murders stopped, and a stalemate ensued. The two exhausted divisions patrolled and exchanged artillery fire as the Allies expanded their beachhead in other areas of the front. On 4 July 1944, the 3rd Canadian Division again went on the attack and captured part of Carpiquet Airfield. The stage was set for the final attack on the city of Caen, which had originally been a D-Day objective. The Battle of Buron, France in July 1944 is notable not just for the detail in which historians have documented the fighting, but also how well that history illustrates the two competing doctrines which shaped the planning and eventual course of events there. The assault on Buron was part of a 5-phase attack launched by the 3 divisions of 1st British Corps, to whom the 3rd Canadian Division belonged at that time. Plans for the HLI to attack Buron had been approved and then cancelled at least twice. After nearly a month occupying positions overlooking the approaches to the town, it was finally time to take it from the Germans. In the darkness before dawn on 8 July 1944, the HLI formed up 2 companies up, 2 companies back. B and D companies were ordered to lead the way to clear the east and west halves of the town respectively, with C Company to act as a reserve, supporting where necessary in clearing the town, and A Company to pass through to take high ground south of the town. The latter mission was based on an inaccurate map, which added a contour line where in fact high ground didn't actually exist. The battalion had a squadron of tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment, a troop of British self-propelled anti-tank guns, and a mixed troop of mine-clearing flail tanks and flamethrower tanks in support. 6 regiments of field guns fired in support of the attack. Given the choice of a creeping barrage or a concentration on the town, the CEO of the HLI opted for the concentration in order to avoid friendly casualties. It was a timed shoot, meaning once their fire mission was complete, the guns shifted fire to support one of the other battalion attacks on the front. The 3rd Battalion of SS Panzergrenadier Regiment 25 was deployed with No. 10 Company on the northern edge of Buron, the 9th Company between Grouchy and Buron, and No. 11 Company in Saint-Contest. Every 4th Company in a German battalion was a heavy weapons company, and thus No. 12 Company had its heavy machine gun and mortar platoons divided up to support the other 3 rifle companies. Buron had strong stone buildings to which the SS men had added a covering screen of landmines and 2 deep anti-tank ditches. The assault companies of the HLI crossed the start line at 0710 hours. The enemy held their fire until the companies reached anti-tank ditches dug outside the town. German infantry in the ditches brought down heavy machine gun fire, and close quarters fighting was needed to clear the ditches at heavy cost to both sides. German mortars and artillery were firing heavy defensive fire tasks, and the Canadians found their infantry radio sets were overcome by more powerful radios than the tank units. The tanks were essential in clearing the ring of machine gun posts on the town's edge, which kept driving the Canadian infantry down to ground. D Company made it into Buron first, but the tanks hit a minefield and couldn't follow. By the time they reached an orchard on the right forward side of the village, they had lost half their strength. Sergeant Herkenrader of No. 18 Platoon rallied whoever was left and took the orchard. Corporal Weitzel led attacks on 2 MG posts and was killed taking the final objective in the orchard. By this point, D Company was down to just 38 men. B Company on the left side of the attack was pinned down by an unusual number of automatic weapons and unable to get tank support up to the suspected minefields. Only an appeal directly and personally to the squadron commander was able to convince them there was no mines there. The tanks engaged the Germans at point-blank range, and the Hitler Youth would not give up even when their trenches were physically overrun by the tanks. They had been trained to lie low and keep fighting after the tank passed over their position. The need for point-blank tank fire meant that some German posts remained occupied until the next day. C Company, in the meantime, fought into the center of town against less opposition and swung left behind B Company. A Company followed them with the battalion headquarters, carrier, anti-tank, and mortar platoons. Casualties among the signalers meant much communication had to be done by runners, slow and dangerous work. It was 11:30 hours before the CO could gather the company commanders and confirm their losses. D Company had 1 officer and 38 other ranks, B Company 1 officer and a third of their men, C Company was half strength, and A Company only had about 2/3 of their full strength. All objectives had been taken, but the enemy was firing heavy mortar and artillery fire. The war diary noted, "The enemy followed his old habits of bringing to bear all the fire he possessed on his own position once it was overrun." C Company moved to where the high ground was indicated on their maps, and B Company came under counterattack by tanks. The war diary identifies them as Tigers, a common battlefield misidentification, but it was in fact the 12th SS Division's Panther Battalion, a mixed group of 20 to 30 Panzerkampfwagen 4 and 5 tanks. The HLI was down to about 50% strength, and the command group suffered a direct hit on their position during an orders group, wounding the CO, 2 majors, and 4 other ranks while killing an officer and 3 signalers. By the time the shooting had stopped, the self-propelled guns and Sherbrooke Fusilier tanks had destroyed either 13 or 14 enemy tanks, depending on which source one consults. More significantly than the exact kill count is the fact that survivors were turned back and withdrew to the southeast, ending the fighting for Buron. Caen finally fell the next day. In all, the HLI lost 262 men killed and wounded at Buron, of a full strength of about 800 officers and men, including 62 dead, the worst casualty toll of any battalion attacking that day. The Sherbrooke Fusilier Squadron lost 11 of its 15 Sherman tanks, and most of the British anti-tank battery's 8 M10 self-propelled guns were damaged or destroyed. The casualties of the 12th SS are harder to calculate. The division as a whole lost about 8,000 men between D-Day and August, according to surviving reports. Histories of Allied operations have typically exaggerated the division's losses, but Zetterling is emphatic that while most of the division's infantry was destroyed in the fighting, the rear services and supporting arms still numbered about 12,000 men when the Hitler Youth left Normandy for good at the end of August 1944. Zetterling also estimates total losses for the entire 12th SS Panzer Division during the week of Charnwood at about 880 dead, wounded, and missing. If the bulk of these happened in the 6 infantry battalions and were evenly distributed, it would mean about 150 men lost at Buron, but this is certainly only the wildest of guesses. The story of the battle has been told in various forms, the best perhaps being the book Bloody Buron, which was recently reprinted by the Remembrance Project and originally published in 1984 by the Highland Fusiliers of Canada, as the HLI was renamed after 1945. This excellent graphic novel also tells the story of Buron through the lens of 2 officers, one who survived the battle and one who did not. As told in pictures and words by the grandson of one of the officers, it provides a vivid and visceral account of the fighting. One aspect of the battle not often discussed is the fact that both sides fought the battle according to their national battle doctrine. Doctrine is not one of those sexy topics that historians and YouTubers go out of their way to talk about, but the Battle of Buron is a clear illustration of how doctrine shaped both planning and executing military ground operations in the Second World War. Distinguished defense industry consultant and wargame designer Frank Chadwick tells a story in the introduction to one of his rule books that highlights the public misconception around what the military term doctrine means. When asked to speak on British military doctrine at a Second World War history symposium, he took the podium, said, "We didn't have any," and left the stage to gales of laughter. Not because it is true, he retook the stage and gave his actual remarks moments later, but because it is widely believed to have been true. A famous and apocryphal quote, variously attributed to an unnamed Wehrmacht and later Soviet general, has often been found pinned up in military offices. The problem with training to fight against Canadian Army doctrine, so the anonymous quote goes, is that they don't have any. This is, of course, patently false. Doctrine is simply defined as a common understanding of fundamentals. Even in the days of swords and sandals, organized armies like that of the Romans had standard operating procedures intended to make optimal use of available resources and maximize success on the battlefield. Even if these procedures weren't codified, they were nonetheless consistently understood and applied. Canadian offensive doctrine and German defensive doctrine were both well defined by 1944 and had their roots from at least as early as the Somme fighting in 1916, 28 years earlier. The First World War is perhaps the least understood military conflict in history, at least as far as popular understanding goes. Thanks to decades of revisionist and counter-revisionist history, the war is seen as years of military stagnation, nestled between the age of linear battle formations and the mobile warfare of the Second World War. In actual fact, the First World War brought about some of the most rapid and extensive changes to the military state-of-the-art in all of history. The extensive use of machine guns and barbed wire meant the death of large formations fighting in the open. Artillery went from deploying forward and firing over open sights in 1914 to shooting sophisticated indirect artillery plans, which made life hazardous even inside the trenches. An arms race began as armies seek to unlock the key to successfully attacking enemy positions, and soon mortars, hand and rifle grenades, poison gas, tanks, and portable automatic weapons all came into their own. As these weapon systems developed, the armies had to learn how to use them. Infantry started the war using 200-man companies as the basic unit of maneuver, armed only with bolt-action rifles and bayonets, charging en masse in order to take objectives. In the face of heavy casualties, the French and Germans started to decentralize command, with the British reluctantly following suit. By 1917, small sections of infantry were expected to take independent action on the battlefield, using low-level tactics, stealth, and all-arms cooperation to successfully overcome defenses, bolstered by barbed wire and massed automatic weapons. On the defense, the Germans learned not to stack all their men in the forward trenches to be blotted out by large volumes of artillery fire. Instead, they started to lightly outpost their front, keeping larger forces available behind the line, often in reverse slopes where they were safer from indirect fire and observation, and to counterattack in strength whenever enemy troops managed to break into their lightly held front line. These concepts carried forward and informed the militaries of the Second World War, and many, of course, are still common military principles to this day. Canada mobilized 2 divisions for active service very reluctantly in 1939, sending the first to Britain that year, and hoping to keep the second at home indefinitely. The invasion of France in May 1940 finally forced the Canadian government to lose its limited liability outlook, and the 3rd and 4th Divisions were mobilized. By 1943, there were 5 Canadian divisions in the UK and 3 more at home. The 1st and 5th Divisions moved to Italy, the 2nd recovered after a mauling at Dieppe, and the 3rd was tapped to make the initial Canadian assault on D-Day. The commander of 2nd Canadian Corps, Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, produced a memo for his Canadian commanders on 14 February 1944. It is as clear a statement of Canadian doctrine as any, and was in effect a blueprint for Canadian commanders in how to attack. Among the highlights, an adequate reconnaissance and preparation was essential to overcome Germans determined to stand fast and defend particular objectives. Strong support of all available artillery would be required to ensure success in taking defended objectives. Attack frontages had to be restricted to maximize available support. Simonds also summarized German defensive doctrine. The essence of the German system of defense is the counterattack. Its forward defenses are not thickly held in terms of men, but are strong in automatic weapons and well supported by mortars sighted up to 3,000 or 4,000 yards in rear of forward defended localities. These mortars are capable of bringing very heavy fire to bear in front of, or within, the German defensive position. Simonds noted a well-planned infantry assault would easily pierce this thin crust of defense, but the Germans would continue to send counterattacks as long as reserve infantry was available, supported by self-propelled guns and tanks. The key to winning the battle, Simonds noted, was to defeat the German counterattacks, which required sufficient reserves on hand by the attackers to launch a new phase after the Germans spent themselves. No plan of attack could therefore exclude the necessity of defeating the German counterattacks. A good plan would arrange for artillery support in this phase, as well as the move of supporting weapons such as mortars and anti-tank guns forward, as well as tank support to move up once the infantry had taken an objective. A plan of attack thus had to consider several things. Firstly, the distance of first objectives from the start line. Overrunning the initial German mortar position set this distance as about 4,000 yards. Without doing this, German mortars would be very dangerous, particularly since German doctrine called for them to be pre-sighted on their own position so they could quickly and accurately be brought to bear once they were lost to the enemy. Simmons noted that the Germans do not hesitate to engage a position on which their own troops are still holding out. Secondly, in planning an attack, the commander had to decide when to employ the bulk of his artillery. The German use of defense in depth meant that Allied artillery would have to redeploy at some point to bring the rearward defenses within range, leaving leading troops on the objective without support. Simmons noted air power was useful at this juncture to fill the gap. Thirdly, Simmons insisted Canadian commanders needed to understand the way Germans supported their infantry during the counterattack phase. Tanks and self-propelled guns were used at close range at whatever objectives they set for their counterattack. Rather than using neutralizing fire, intended only to keep Allied heads down, they preferred aimed fire at individual Allied infantry positions through their telescopic sights. In a bit of understatement, Simmons noted the moral and material effect on our own troops of this type of fire is considerable. To counter the effects of this unnerving use of high-explosive tank shells at close range, Simmons suggested the use of at least 2 of 3 remedies: keeping anti-tank guns up close to the leading infantry, tanks following close behind the leading infantry, and medium artillery concentrations directed onto German tanks and self-propelled guns by an artillery forward observation officer co-located with the leading infantry. Historian Terry Copp noted that Simmons' doctrinal vision was fine, but in practice many flaws exposed themselves. The Sherman-type tanks allocated for infantry support were thinly armored, and their vulnerabilities to enemy tanks, anti-tank guns, and infantry anti-tank weapons meant they were often unable to stay forward with the infantry or stay on station to fight the German counterattacks. The Allied self-propelled anti-tank guns were even more thinly armored, and by their own doctrine stayed to the rear as often as possible. The towed anti-tank guns of the infantry battalions and the divisional artillery took time to get ahead with the infantry. This left only the artillery available to help break up German counterattacks. The air support that Simmons thought could bridge the gap in firepower coverage proved vulnerable to the large numbers of German anti-aircraft guns in theater. A central concept of German defensive doctrine was the elastische Kampfverfahren, literally elastic battle procedure, but known in English more commonly as elastic defense. An elastic defense was divided into 3 zones: combat outposts with minimal personnel serving as lookouts and to delay enemy patrols, the main battle zone, 500 to 3,000 meters deep, with trenches and strongpoints covering key terrain, often on reverse slopes which minimized exposure to enemy observation and supporting fires, and finally a rear zone with artillery and mobile reserves ready to counterattack. The elastic defense challenged long-held beliefs about defensive warfare. Instead of stopping cold any attacks in front of their positions and doggedly clinging to every scrap of terrain under friendly control, the elastic defense not only permitted enemy penetrations, but encouraged them. The enemy infantry would get bogged down fighting through a series of defensive positions instead of a single thick crust of defenders, exhausting themselves and exposing them to artillery in the middle of the main battle zone. Once they were disorganized, they could be more easily counterattacked. One German soldier in 1916 wrote of how the romantic conception of life in trenches had fallen away to a new type of technical proficiency. In his words, "The spirit of adventure is dead. We have become wise, serious, and professional. Formerly the dugout walls were adorned with pictures. Now they are covered with maps, orders, and reports. Formerly the men christened their dugouts. Now they are simply numbered." Elastic defense became the byword of the German army in April 1917, and the post-war army codified it in 1921 and 1923. To the 3 zones envisioned in 1917 was added a 4th, the advanced position, with light mobile infantry and artillery which could disrupt an advancing force, causing them to deploy early. The advanced troops would then retreat back to the rear for use as reserves. As the post-war German army transformed under the Wehrmacht in the 1930s, elastic defense lost favor as the concepts of mechanization and mobile warfare were explored. Anti-tank obstacles and minefields were added to the battle zone, with tanks added to the rear zone, though early on it was expected they would only be needed to fight enemy tanks that broke through to the rear, not be used in the counterattacks. The increase in mobility was accompanied by a dictum that defensive operations be conducted with flexibility, retaining the concept of defense in depth. By doctrine, a reinforced battalion was expected to defend a front of 5,000 meters to a depth of at least 3,000 meters. With a clearer understanding of doctrine, one starts to understand more why certain decisions have been made on both sides. The decision by the Germans to maroon their men in the anti-tank ditches makes much more sense when it is realized they were the outposts. Their job was to slow down the enemy attack so that mortars and machine guns could be brought to bear on them, and that is exactly what happened. The war diarist's comment about the Germans' old habit of firing on their own position illustrates nicely that the Germans, too, had planned a defense of the town with doctrine firmly in mind. The objectives of the HLI attack on Buron were placed south of the town, not only to get clear of the initial enemy positions, which were pre-registered by the Germans, but also of necessity to secure a start line for the attack of the Canadian-Scottish Regiment in the next phase of the operation. The entire division needed to push through the 5-kilometer deep German defensive zone in order to defeat the 12th SS and finally enter Caen, and this is exactly what happened. Amateur historians and wargamers are all aware of the dictum about never reinforcing defeat, and from that perspective, the attack by the Panthers of 1st Battalion, SS Panzer Regiment 12 seems like a wasted effort. But in fact, this was exactly part of their defensive doctrine, designed to inflict heavy casualties on the attacking force, which had swept beyond their mortar targets. The application of doctrine may seem to be nothing more than common sense when viewed in hindsight, but for real troops under actual fire, the right thing to do is not always apparent. Major F.A. Sparks, commanding headquarters company of the HLI, noted in an after-action analysis that German artillery was often made more effective when friendly attacking troops stopped to take cover behind stone walls instead of pushing through to the far edge of the village. That probably seemed easier said than done when faced with massed machine guns in the narrow confines of the town. Sparks likewise observed that supporting companies should have gone to the flanks rather than the center of the objective, and also that the anti-tank guns, which had been wisely deployed with the attacking troops, as Simmons had recommended 5 months before D-Day, had been crucial to holding on to Buron once captured. In other words, we can conclude, Simmons' advice in February 1944 proved to be sound in practice. Both the 3rd Canadian Infantry and the 12th SS Panzer Divisions were relatively inexperienced in general, and in particular in the roles they were asked to play on 8 July 1944, launching and defending against a full-scale assault, respectively. We can suffice to say that the battle was conducted by both sides exactly as one would have expected them to, and commanders on both sides might properly be held blameless for the unfortunate casualty toll. Finesse in operations, with an attendant reduction in casualties, seems to be a luxury more often associated with veteran formations, or other units greatly outclassing their opponents, not relatively evenly matched newcomers to battle, such as these two divisions were.